Hi, my name is Paul Arnold, sometimes known as the Stuttering Professor, and I'm a strategic planner, facilitator, trainer, amongst other things. And as you can see, I've read quite a few books. I haven't read all of them, but I've read a sizable chunk of them. And I've summarised over 50 business books. And today I want to talk about this classic, Getting to Yes, Negotiating an Agreement Without Giving In, by Roger Fisher and William Ury. So the book in a nutshell, principled negotiation is based on 4 key factors, which he calls PIOC, or they call PIOC. People. Separate the people from the problem. Interests. Focus on interests, not positions. Options. Create options for mutual gain. And see the criteria, agree criteria for decision making up front. And I love this sort of quote from JFK: let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear negotiating. So let's dig into the book in a little bit more detail. So, this idea that, we are always in negotiation. A lot of our relationships are about negotiating, and therefore it plays a very powerful part in all of our lives. And the people who can negotiate better get a better quality outcome for their life, for their business, for their team, whatever. So go into these 4 principles, the PIOC again. The first one is people. Separate the people from the problem. Now, we've got to get the emotions and egos out of the room as much as you can. We've got to remember that people often come into the negotiating room high on anxiety. And we need to be aware that emotions can easily be triggered through certain words, quips, tonality, cultural mishaps, non-verbal communication, etc. So we've got to be really aware and to really sense, if we are dancing on the right platform when we're talking with them. And then people can easily misinterpret the meaning of what we're trying to do, and we've got to be really attuned into that when we're in negotiation. Therefore, it's key to first identify the emotions on both sides, on what's going on for you, what's going on for them, and then try to take that out the room before formal negotiations start. And you may just have to name what's going on. Now, the thing in the book is, the book really focuses upon the fact that most negotiation, most important negotiations, happen with people who we have got long-term relationships with. Be it inside an organization, be it with a partner, whatever. So we shouldn't lose sight of what is really important. And sometimes, we should be prepared to go and, give in on that for the longer term stuff. So in other words, see the bigger picture in all this rather than just focus on that one very simple win. Because if you try to push for a win, and they see it as a loss, they may remember that, and you may cause bigger problems in the long run. So the key thing is spend time up front to build a trusting, empathic, respectful relationship. Preferably well before the negotiation period happens, as this is the key to successful negotiation, because then the truth can be heard in that room. And all too often we get lost in the details of the negotiation, the minute points, and we ignore the impact on the people. And we've got to work on building the relationship. The more we can move from talking to strangers to talking to people we know, the better. Thus, every negotiation has 2 axes to focus on: the substance of the negotiation and the relationship. It's going to be both the what and the how is going to be critical. Now, we often see the issues differently from the others, and so we can misinterpret, so it's key to always summarize what we believe we have heard, and to respect that they may have another sort of perspective on that. And I always talk about the multiplicity of truth, and to recognize that maybe they've got some information that would be really useful for us as well. So you've got to come to that being open. And the second point is we shouldn't be too binary. We tend to see the merits of our argument, our things are fantastic, here are all the great benefits, and yours are all rubbish. That binary nature is just not going to cut the mustard. It's just going to fall on stony ground. And instead, we need to step into the other side's shoes. We need to understand not only the context and the issues, but the emotional intensity people feel about it. You really got to see the argument from their side. Why is it important? What's important? And if we don't acknowledge and address all that, then we're not really opening up the chance to have a negotiation. On the more tangible aspects, we've got to see the bigger picture, not just the small details. In the book, it also says it's important to get the key stakeholders in the discussions early on. Now, from my experience, that's often much more difficult to do than one first thing, because one often holds back people later on. So in other words, even before you start negotiating, you say, well, let's agree who's going to be in the room. Point 2 of the PIAC is interest. Focus on interests, not positions. It's critical to be clear what we really want and what the other persons also want. And critically, this is rarely our initial bargaining position, which disguises what is really important. So, I always say, we've got to keep asking why, the 5 whys, so we can reach the higher reasons that drive the demand. Why is that important? Why is that important? Why is that so? Now we get to somewhere up there, which are now we understand what really is important. We may find new strategies. Well, we can't address that, but we can do something about that. And often if we can sort of, find the higher level goal, and we find we've got a shared higher level goal, that again makes it work so much better. Also we've got to ask why not. This also helps highlight what's at stake, especially when exploring alternatives. And identify all their interests. Often it's not the top ones that hold up negotiating, but the small ones that often go unsurfaced until much later on. You've got to get all their stuff out on the table at the same time. And sometimes their interests are in different areas from your own, which allows for some easy quick wins. Very often we just want to get a quick win there, show some positive intent. We'll give you that is a very classic way that we help a negotiation get off to a good start. And the most powerful interests in any negotiations are the basic human needs. So we've got to look at what is really important, and we've got to look at the fundamental needs of security, of safety, the fundamental need of a sense of belonging, the fundamental need for recognition and acknowledgement, the fundamental need for a sense of equality, and the fundamental need for control and agency over one's life. So these are the big important things that if you can nail those, you're much more likely to get to a positive negotiated outcome. And communicate your interests. Look, very often there's a game being played where everyone's holding their cards close to their chest, but actually negotiating is all about communication. And the more open you are, the more you encourage them to be open, because that's the purpose. So we need to, in some ways, be prepared to be more explicit about what we want rather than hoping they're going to guess it. So when we reveal our interests up front, we're much more likely we're going to stimulate the other side to do the same as well. Say, look, let's be truthful about that. And that may just happen. A private conversation happens, as you're walking down the corridor. But you've got to get the real truth out of what's going on. And then we always about bring interest to life. The why behind the what. It is our role to sell our interest to the other side and make them appreciate how important it is. The more they experience emotionally our interest, the greater the likelihood they will be influenced. They're going to see, wow, I really understand now why that's so important to you. We've got to get it out of the cognition into the bodily emotional response to it. And we've got to respect their position. Do not denigrate their point of view. At this stage, we should not dismiss or rubbish their position, as that just puts up barriers and defends them more likely to walk out of the room. Instead, listen to learn. Respect they have a legitimate different point of view on something. And only when a person feels understood, listened to and respected will they then offer us the same courtesy. And we say be hard on the problem but soft on the people. Thus we may attack the issue and be really sort of driving that, but always be supportive and respectful of the people about that stuff. Because otherwise when the egos get hurt, then you're going to be on a losing platform. Focus on the future, not the past. Too often negotiations get caught up in the pain and the emotion of stuff that happened in the past. You know, and you've got to be spending the time on what needs to happen to get the future where we both need it to be. Another critical point is you've got to help them to be able to sell it in to their bosses or to other people. You know, how easy would this be for them to sell those proposals back into their organisers, back to their bosses or whatever? Point number 3 in the POC, options. Create options for mutual gain. Breakdowns often happen when one party demands one thing, the other party are not flexible. And if we understand their real interests going up that why, then it allows the creation of a range of other solutions. And that allows to break through impasses. When things dry to halt, you've got to put options on the table. So you've got to co-create options with them. So, well, let's talk about this. And like I say, you've got to look it through the eyes of, you know, different experts, look it through their eyes, what would make sense for them. And then break the problem down to smaller parts. And then you may be able to find, you know, to almost like inch it forward, you know, let's resolve that bit. We get that bit sorted out, we can get that bit sorted out. The bigger bits we'll have to leave for a little later, but get some of the bits sorted out. And clustering together some of the weaker ideas to make a strong unified one. If we put that together with that and that, how will that work? So finalise it. Then point number 4 in the POC was criteria. Agree criteria for decision making up front. We must agree the ground rules for decision making up front before we get into the negotiating room, because otherwise the goalposts may move, you know, and we can't afford to be doing that because that's just going to undermine the whole thing. So some further techniques and strategies talked about in the book. You know, what if they are more powerful? Well, frankly, if they have all the power, then the reality we're not in negotiation. But very often, we often underestimate the power of our own position versus the other side. And we must never lose sight of that. In the book, it talks about this really critical that's called the BATNA. And we talk about LDAs, the least desired outcome, and the MDA or MDO, the most desired outcome. The best alternative to a negotiated agreement is what BATNA stands for. Best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Because we need to decide our walk away position. In other words, what's the lowest point we're prepared to do a deal with? And at that point we say, you know what? We got another option. So let's say you want to buy a car. You go and see this car. You know there's another 25 cars exactly the same as that. You don't need to be driven to hard on the bargain. Because you say, right, there's another one of those out there. So if you know what else you could do, you know you'll walk away, you know what else you could do without negotiating with them, then it puts you into a really strong place. You know, and what the least desired outcome is, that's the minimum you're prepared to accept before you go to before you walk away. And then you have your most desired outcome. And in between that is the negotiating space. And you've got to remember that they will also have their LDOs and their MDOs. And so therefore that reduces the space. But you've got to find something that is mutually agreeable. We've got to get a win-win. And ideally, we really want to push for a bigger win-win and not just be carving up the pie. And then the other thing is that they say is ask questions. Questions do not criticize, but they educate and they show respect. And then you've got to do your homework. As with many areas in life, the more we prepare in advance, the greater the likelihood of success. So gather as many facts as you can from as many different areas as possible. Otherwise, you're not really helping yourself in that space. So critique, look, this is one of the classics of negotiation books. It forms a very solid basis of the theory of negotiation. Bit short on practical, tangible specifics, and nor does it really discuss the different types of negotiation that takes place. What I'd also say is the basic, assumptions of principles, wise, efficient, and relationships can be questioned. For example, in many cases, there may be no long-term relationship, so who cares for a win-win, So anyway, I think it's a good book. I think there are other even better negotiation books. And I think you've got to sort of, at the end of the day, you've got to learn the art of negotiation. Anyway, I hope that helps.